Thank you everyone for having me. It's definitely a privilege and a blessing, and yeah, I'm glad this worked out, and I praise God that the timing worked out well. And so yeah, I'm glad to be here. You're gonna have to mind I'm still kind of jet lagged, and so not after Jason used all our brain energy for for that game. Hopefully you guys can follow through, but. Some of you guys were here last night. It's good to see you back. And I'm just, because there's so many new faces this morning, I'll just do a little bit of introduction of who I am again. Just to give you a bit of context so you guys who know who I am and so forth. So, as Jason said, I'm, family of 5. So that's my wife, Krista, there. And we have 3 children. My oldest is Jaden, who's in the middle. And my daughter, Michaela. So Jaden's 15, Michaela's 13. And Zachary is he's 9.5, and so they're back in Australia still right now. So you can pray for her, pray for them. But yeah, so anyway, and also we have a dog, and his name is Taco. And I never wanted a dog ever because we always said we're gonna come visit home in America every year. It's too hard to have a dog, but then the pandemic hit, and my daughter convinced me to have a dog, and but I'm glad we did. He's a small little fur ball. But anyway, so I am from Australia, and I'm from Perth, Australia. Anybody know Perth, Australia? Heard of where Perth is? When you think of Australia, you know where Perth is.
Yeah, I've heard it. Somewhere, I believe it's on like the East Coast.
It's on the other coast, close. Yeah. So most people, I mean, when we were asked to go to Perth, I said, where is Perth? Because all I know is Sydney and Melbourne. Most people just only know Sydney and Melbourne.
Is it the north of the Australia?
No, it's actually on the west.
West?
So, let's see if this works. No, whatever. Anyway, it does work. Yeah, right there. So Perth is on the west coast right here. That's Perth. And you can see Sydney and Melbourne all on the other side. So we live on the west coast, which has been a huge change because my whole life I grew up in New York, which is the east coast. And moving to the West Coast, everything's so different now. We're always behind the schedule, And so Perth is a small city, so this is like a night view of Perth. Really small city, a little bit less than 3 million people in the city of Perth. But it's really famous and known for its beautiful beaches. And so along the coast. So, I remember when we went there, I couldn't believe this is where we go for our beach. I felt like from New York, you'd have to go on a holiday to travel to the Caribbean and see beaches like this, but this is just our normal beach. And so it's famous for its beaches, and because it's on the West Coast, it's all famous for its sunsets. And so, so it's sometimes I wake up and I go, I can't believe we live here. It's a paradise, it's beautiful. However, it is really far from Long Island. And that's where my families are. Both my wife, both our families live here. And they say that if you were to take Perth and New York and go through the center of the earth, that's where you come out on the other side. It's directly the opposite side of the world. And so it doesn't matter which way you go. I've gone, going across to Hong Kong over to Alaska, and I've gone all the way through Singapore to the Middle East. It's both about 25 hours of flight. That's not including layovers and stuff. So it's a great place to live. However, it's a very hard place to do ministry because life is so comfortable in Perth. People don't need God. That's the simplest way of saying it. When life is too good, you don't think about things like God or eternity or faith, it's just all before you. But obviously, even people there still need God, and so we've been there for, 17 years now. So we left in 2006, before we had children, my wife and I, Krista and I. So that's a little bit of who I am, would love to get to know you over today and even tomorrow. I'll be here tomorrow morning to speak again, but I want to kind of get started this morning and afternoon about this idea of faith that matters, and it does build from last night, but I'll review that in a minute. But I just want to kind of give you a picture of what we want to talk about when I say faith that matters. And I'll tell you the story. So my daughter, Michaela, she would have been maybe about 6 or 7 years old at the time. And the one thing you got to know about Michaela is she's got that personality, like she just loves organization. Okay? Like we didn't teach her this, she was just born this way. You know, she likes to dot her I's, she likes to cross her T's. And it's probably why like she's our artist in our family. She draws beautiful art, very creative. And I remember one time we were moving some furniture around, and I was building an IKEA bed. You know, anyone here ever build furniture, like those flat boxes? Yeah, I don't mind doing that, but but this particular piece of furniture at one point, like I needed somebody to help me because the way that they were constructing the pieces, they had a lot of these screws that you had to put a washer on it and then have a bolt, right? And so like it was just going to be too costly for me to take one because I think there was like 30 of them. So she comes over and, hey, Daddy, do you want help? I'm like, oh, I'd love for you to help me, sure. And I said, okay, I need you to arrange these bolts and screws for me so that when I'm, have one hand up, I can just grab it and go, right? And so she's like, oh, I can do that. So then I'm getting everything ready, and and then something else went wrong, and I had to go back. And anyway, it was like 30, 40 minutes before I actually got her to do the work. And she goes, Dad, I finished. And I'm like, oh, that's great. So I'm ready to put it together, and I look down. But instead of putting all the screws in a set together like I was hoping she'd do, that I could just grab it, she literally laid out all the swashers in one section. Then she laid out all the screws or the bolts in one section and all the nuts. But it wasn't just laid out. It was like perfectly balanced and even. It was beautiful, right? Like she spent so much time arranging this perfectly display of these materials. But I'm going, this is not helpful for me because I still have to grab each one and do it. And the reason I'm telling you the story was she spent all this time, all this activity to get it just right the way she wanted. But it didn't matter to me. It wasn't the purpose. It didn't matter. You see, the thing I ask myself all the time as a pastor, and then I ask when I disciple people or mentor people, and we talk about walking with Jesus, following Jesus. And if you've been a follower of Jesus for even just a year, a few months, a few weeks, or for most of your life, one of the things you realize is we do a lot of things to be a follower. Like there's a lot of activity when we practice faith, right? And the question I've always been asking in the last 10 years or so, as I've been trying to mature my faith, is going, what actually matters to God in our faith? Is it possible, like my daughter, we've spent all this time doing all these things and we think we get it so perfectly lined up, but at the end of the day, God's like, that's not what I want you to do. It's not what matters. And so that's kind of the whole genesis of this idea. And and I was when I started conversations with Michelle and Jason with Zoom, a few months ago about this, and I asked, what is it that you want me to come and speak about? And they were very gracious and said, well, what do you feel like God's put in your heart? And I said, well, for the better half of the last 8 to 10 years, this has been a big part of my passion to talk to people about, because I think it's really important. I think it's really important that if we want to commit our lives to follow Jesus, we want to commit our lives and give our lives and follow him, it seems to make sense to me that we want to live in a way that matters to God, or have a faith that matters. Because there's nothing more disappointing, I think, and nothing, and not just disappointment in the sense of like God will be angry. I mean more of we don't receive the full blessings of following God if we try to live a life of faith that doesn't matter. Do you track with me? Do you follow what I'm saying? And so that's what today is going. Today, we have 2 sessions today, and even tomorrow morning, Pastor was generous to give me the privilege to speak Sunday morning. And so this whole weekend is really wrapped into this idea of what does faith look like? A faith that matters to God and a faith that matters to us. And so that's kind of the vision of what this today's about. And so, that's what we're going to do, talk about today. Now, last night, some of the guys were here. I see a few faces. And so just want to quickly recap, because every session kind of ties into one another and they build upon each other, right? So last night we had a very fundamental concept that you really need to deeply understand if you want to live a life where your faith matters, right? So last night we just simply talked about the difference between knowing God and knowing about God, right? And, we just spent a bit of time saying, I might know a lot of things about a celebrity, right? But I don't know who that celebrity is. I don't know that person. I don't have a relationship. I know a lot about the celebrity. I can tell you all the facts, but I don't know him or her. And that's really important when it comes to knowing God, that a lot of times I come across a lot of Christians, and when I spend time with them, and I would say, this is how I was for most of my life, I could tell you a lot about God. But if someone ever asked, the first time someone asked me this question, do you love God? And I'm like, of course I love God. And then they said, well, how do you know? Like, how do you love God? What is it that how can you describe? And as I thought about it, I'm going, I just realized, no, I love the things about God. I love what he does for me. I love the things that I can pray and give me, or if I'm scared, I can pray for him. But it really dawned on me, I don't know God like I would know my parents. I don't know God like the way I would know my wife. You wouldn't think I would have a really good marriage if I said to you, I don't really know my wife, I just know about my wife, right? She's 5'2", blonde hair, blue eyes, and she dresses in these kind of. If that's all I could tell you about my wife, you sit back and go, he doesn't really know his wife, right? You'd expect answers like, this is what makes her cry. This movie is her favorite movie. This is her favorite kinds of food. She likes it, when I say this to her, or she doesn't like it when I say that. Then you start going, then he really knows his wife a little bit more. And so that's what I'm saying. We have to ask ourselves, do I know God? Or do I know about God? And that's a fundamental thing that we have to ask ourselves and understand. Because to know God is to have a relationship with God. And then to know God, if you know someone, then you understand their heart. You understand what beats, what's their convictions, what their values are, right? And we just said last night a very simple thing, that a good step to understand about knowing God, knowing the heart of the Father, is simply that it doesn't matter what any of us feel about ourselves. It doesn't matter if we carry shame. It doesn't matter if we feel we're a bad person. What matters to God is that we matter to him. It's fundamental truth. If you want to live a life full of faith that matters, this is absolutely essential. Because otherwise, you will grow up, or you will mature, or be, ironically immature way of thinking God is somebody entirely else. You will think that God might be a punishing father, that if you don't do something right, then he won't love you anymore. That God is a vindictive God, right? And so we have to fundamentally, the gospel of Jesus Christ is planted on this truth. That the heart of the Father is to love you no matter what you feel about yourself, or no matter what you do, because of what Jesus did on the cross. So that's where we were last night, okay? So everyone's caught up now, okay? The guys who were here last night, it's like, you could have just said that in 15 minutes. Why did we have to be here for an hour and a half last night, right? Anyway, so we're all caught up now. And so today, we're going to start, and I want to begin with a story, a fable. And you guys know what fables are? They're like made up stories to prove a point, right? And so I'm going to read you a story, a fable, and it's called, everybody heard of the frog and the scorpion? Heard of a fable called The Frog and the Scorpion? No? Okay, that's all right. Well, I'll read it to you now. So, it says this: one day, a scorpion, you guys know what a scorpion is, right? Like the stingers and all that? Okay. A scorpion looked around at the mountain where he lived and decided that he wanted to change. So he set out on a journey through the forest and hills. He climbed over rocks, under vines, and he kept going until he reached a river. The river was wide and swift, and the scorpion stopped to reconsider the situation. He couldn't see any way to cross the river. So he ran up the river, and then he checked down the river, all the while thinking that he might have to turn back. Suddenly he saw a frog sitting in the rushes, bushes, by the bank of the stream on the other side of the river. He decided to ask the frog for help getting across the stream. "Hello, Mr. Frog," called the scorpion across the water. "Would you be so kind as to give me a ride on your back across the river?" "Well now, Mr. Scorpion, how do I know that if I try to help you, you won't try to kill me?" asked the frog hesitantly. "Because," the scorpion replied, "if I try to kill you, then I would die too. For you see, I cannot swim. Now this seemed to make sense to the frog, but he asked, what about when I get close to the bank? You could still try to kill me and get back to the shore. This is true, agreed the scorpion, but then I wouldn't be able to get to the other side of the river. All right then, how do I know you won't just wait till we get to the other side and then kill me, said the frog. Ah, crooned the scorpion, because you see, once you've taken me to the other side of this river, I would be so grateful for your help, it would hardly be fair to reward you with death. Now, wouldn't it? So the frog agreed to take the scorpion across the river. He swam over the bank and settled himself near the mud to pick up his passenger. The scorpion crawled onto the frog's back, his sharp claws prickling into the frog's soft hide, and the frog slid into the river. The muddy waters swirled around them, but the frog stayed near the surface, so the scorpion would not drown. He kicked strongly through the first half of the stream, his flippers paddling wildly against the current. Halfway across the river, the frog suddenly felt a sharp sting in his back, and out of the corner of his eye, he saw the scorpion remove his stinger from the frog's back. A deadening numbness began to creep into his limbs. You fool, croaked the frog. Now we both shall die. Why on earth did you do that? The scorpion shrugged and did a little jig on the drowning frog's back. I could not help myself. It is my nature. They both sank into the muddy waters of the swiftly flowing river. Now, every fable has a moral, and that's not the reason why I wanted to tell this fable, is to talk about the moral. What I do want to do is I want to kind of give you what maybe a modern version of this fable, how it would end. And there's a reason why I want to do that. This is like a modern version of that whole fable. It says the scorpion needs a ride across the river. The waters are rising on account of a climate change, or perhaps has been priced out of his burrow. Who knows? The exact reason is lost in the fog of pre-modernity. The frog is afraid that the scorpion will sting him, but his would-be passenger reassures him that they would both die if that happened. That would be crazy. Sure enough, halfway across, the scorpion stings the frog, and just before they drown, the scorpion says, "Aren't you going to ask why I did that?" And the frog croaks, "You do you. You do you." Anybody heard of that phrase? You do you? Anybody have used that phrase? You do you? It actually comes from the birth of this phrase called you do you. It comes from the urban communities, where they basically says, you do you and I'll do me. And it's this idea of saying, basically it's this way of saying, you know what, you keep your opinions to yourself, right? And then you let me do what I want to do, and then you do what you want to do. So you do you and I do me. It's this common phrase, right? There's a whole bunch of these kinds of phrases, right? You've heard of things like, it is what it is, okay? These are called Tato phrases, if you really want to know. But these are phrases that sort of, it repeats itself, but it has this meaning, right? It is what it is. Haters are gonna hate, right? All that kind of stuff. But you do you is an interesting one, right? It's a prevalent term now, right? And nowadays, it's this concept where it's used in a way to be like, you know what? To celebrate who you are. It doesn't matter how different you are. It doesn't matter what you do might be strange. And we want to celebrate the diversity of everyone. So you do you. That's how it's used. Everyone understand? Now, when I grew up a long time ago, right? So when I was early teens, right? We're talking about early 1990s now, late 1980s. We had no such phrase called you do you. And I reflected upon this. I reflected going, you know what? I grew up, I went to school in the Islip School District, that area, right? And I don't know how Long Island is now, but I just remember being one of maybe 3 Chinese kids in the school. Okay, that was Islip. It was very different for me to grow up in that environment. I always felt out of place. I always felt left out. I reflected upon this recently, that if the term you do you existed when I grew up in high school, it would have been so much easier for my life. I would probably have more confidence. I would have more self-esteem. You know, because growing up as the only Asian kid in a predominantly, Caucasian environment, it was difficult. You always looked different, you know? This is how and this is going to be silly. I don't know if my parents even know this, but there were times, I had friends and they would joke around about my Asian, my Chinese nose, and they'd be saying, "Oh, your nose is so flat." And they were just joking around, but it made me so self-conscious. I wanted to fit in so badly that there were nights where I would get a clothespin and I'd pinch my nose to sleep, hoping that in the morning it'd be a little bit more pointy, right? Or in Australia, I always tell my kids, because in Australia, in the public school system, they have to wear uniforms. And I said, you don't know how lucky you are to have to wear uniforms. Because the amount of pressure it is to be in the public school here, to have to figure out if you have enough cool clothing, do you have the right brands, all that kind of stuff. And when I grew up, we didn't have a lot of money and we didn't spend money on brand names. And so every day I went to school, I'm constantly worried, am I wearing the right clothes? Am I cool enough? Is it the right brands, right? If only the term "you do you" existed back then, it would help me. Your nose is flat. It's okay, you do you. You want to wear these non-brand names? Go ahead, you do you. Ronnie, you be you and you do you. See, I don't have a problem with this concept. You do you is actually, it has its merits in today's society. I agree where there's certain situations where you do you is a very empowering and encouraging phrase. But it also has a downside to you do you. The first one is that you do you presupposes a very big question. That if you do who you are, it presupposes that you are actually a good person, right? So for instance, if, for example, little Johnny, he's only 5 foot tall, but he loves basketball, and he loves to play basketball. So he's out there playing, trying out for the JV team or the varsity team among, 6 foot people, and he's playing his heart out at 5 foot tall. And you go, you know what, Johnny? Don't let anybody tell you can't do this. You do you. Empowering. Makes sense. That's a proper use of that phrase, a helpful use of that phrase. But let's say little Johnny, forget basketball now, right? But he's in the school and he sees this iPhone on the table that he really likes. And he's like, I'm going to steal that iPhone because I want it. Because I'm going to do me. I want something, I get it. So Johnny goes and steals it, and I go, Johnny, you know what? You do you. You want that iPhone, you steal it, because that's who you are. Not such a proper use of that anymore, right? So you do you, one of the problems with you do you is that it presupposes that whoever is being themselves, there's an innate good nature about them. There's something good about that, right? You can't just say you do you, and then the world will fall apart if everyone just did who they wanted to be. That's one of my concerns about you do you. But I have an even bigger concern about you do you. And it has more to do with fundamentally, really in essence, the creation of our world and how God created who we are. See, the problem with you do you is that it now makes you become the designer, the creator, and the determiner of who you are, right? Does that make sense? Right. Oops. The idea of saying you do you, what it's saying is that, you know what, whoever you want to be, you become that person, right? You want to be this or that. You identify something, you do that. Like, that's our world right now. The fundamental problem with that is that we were created by God. We were created by God. He created us. We were not the creator. We are his creation. So there's a fundamental conflict here. A creation cannot be a creator at the same time. Does that make sense? Right? You either are created or you're creator. You can't be both creation and creator. And so you do you confuses that for all of us now. Right? We feel like we have this power to become who we want, but that's not how this world was built. It's not how we were built. We were built by God to be created in his image. And so you do you really confuses this issue. Because we no longer recognize God as creator. And when we want to be the creation and with the power and equal, I mean, this is the very essence of the whole Genesis story in the beginning, right? God created Adam and Eve, right? Everything was perfect. What went wrong? They wanted to be like God. They wanted to be creation and creator. That was the temptation. And once they decided to go that path, everything went wrong. See, here's the problem with you do you. And here's the problem with us trying to be the creator of our own identity. We all live in a broken and hurting world. You just watch the news. I just watched the news this morning for 5 minutes and I'm depressed. This world is broken. There's like hardly any good news, right? We live in a broken world. And because of that, we often create this sense of, who we think we are out of our brokenness. Like, so each of them, forget the world now. Just think individually, you and I. Like, just think about yourselves, right? In your own life, there are things in your life that you hurt from or that you feel broken about. And so just on a human natural level, what we normally do is we try to do things to heal that brokenness, to fix that hurt, right? And what happens is we create this false self of who we are, right? It's someone that we're not who we really are, but we live out this false self so that we create this false self to cover the hurt, to cover the brokenness. And it's out of that false self that we start, in that brokenness, that we start identifying of the three things that we're good at. So this is how it normally happens, right? You might, like for me, I struggle with self-esteem. Some people might struggle with, confidence. Some people might struggle with abuse. It can get really dark real quick with this conversation. So what happens though is people, they recognize that hurt, that's something that's missing, but then they also recognize, hey, you know what? I'm good at this. Maybe you're good at sports. Maybe you're good at cooking. Maybe you're good at schoolwork, academics, right? Maybe you're good at making money. Whatever it is, you find out, hey, I'm good at this. And so what happens is, to alleviate the pain of the hurt, you focus on the things that you're good at, or at least what people tell you might be good at. And then suddenly you create this false self about where your identity is about that. So you're no longer, Ronnie, child of God, or Ronnie, son of my parents. I am Ronnie, what am I good at? Talking. That's not a good one, right? Maybe, I don't know. But, let's just say I was good at sports, but I'm only okay at it. Okay? But, so I become Ronnie the athlete. Everything about me is about, and so what happens though, because that's my false self. And so, because I'm good at it, I'm just gonna keep going at it and keep going at it, and that becomes my identity. Right? See this all the time. You might be sitting here right now going, I think I do that too. Maybe not all the time. See, you do you encourages this thinking. The implication is that this is who you are, this is your identity, but it's confusing with who you are to what you do. That's a big question there. See, this is the biggest problem in our world, especially in the Western society. When people ask, or you might ask yourself, who am I? That's like the question of everyone's life. Who am I? What's my purpose? Right? It's two separate questions. Who am I? And what's my purpose are two separate questions. Why I keep pressing that? Who am I? Right? And what's my purpose are two separate. Who am I talks about a being. What's my purpose is a doing question. But what happens is when you say you do you, ignore that right now. When we say you do you, we answer both in the same question. Who am I? What's my purpose? What do I do? And you do you really encourages that. You want to be someone? You do you. Not you be you, but you do you. And this is why a lot of times we get confused and we struggle in life. Because in our search to discover who I am, my value, my worth, my identity, we're always quick to go, what can I do to fill that hole? And this is the problem. We're going to get into that a little bit today. It works when everything you do is good. It works. So when life is well, I got a good job, I'm kicking butt at work, I'm getting paid well, look at my beautiful house, look at my car, I've got a beautiful marriage, I've got good children, or if maybe you guys are younger, you don't think it that far, but you're just like, I'm doing really well at school, I've got plenty of friends, every time I ask for something, I get it, life is comfortable. Like, you feel good about your life because what you do is going so well. But as soon as what you do doesn't go so well, you feel that test. Your boss doesn't give you the promotion. Suddenly something goes wrong, and suddenly you feel your sense of worth just drop. If that's ever happened to you, the reason that's why it's happened to you, it's because you put your identity of your self-worth into what you do. And that is very dangerous. That is not the way of God. That is not a way of living the faith that matters. Because that's not how God designed us. So you do use not the way I would suggest to have faith that matters. What I'm going to suggest today is this other passage. Well, not passage, but this other phrase. Whose I am before who I am. Whose I am before who I am. Starting from a place of acceptance. What does it mean by whose I am before who I am? Let me go to this chart. Genesis tells us that we are created by God, right? And so this idea is that we are of God. Not that he owns us like property, but we come from God. Think about we are created in God's image. Have you ever paused to just focus on that phrase? I know in church we say things all the time that we go, oh yeah, I know, we're creating God's image. We just say it like it's, like saved by grace, not by works. We're creating God's image. Just pause. Have you ever paused to think about what that means? We were created in God's image. Think about that. I'm a big sports fan. Anybody a big sports fan here? Yeah? Okay. What do you? Anybody like basketball? Okay, not basketball. What sport do you like, buddy?
Soccer.
Soccer. Okay.
Football.
American football? All right, I can talk American football. Okay. What's your favorite team? Who's your favorite player? Pat Mahomes. All right, we'll go with Pat Mahomes. You know Pat Mahomes, right? Is that? All right. So Patrick Mahomes, he's like the best quarterback in the NFL right now, right? If say you were throwing a football around. And somebody comes up to you, man, it's like you've came from the same DNA of Patrick Mahomes. That's an incredible compliment, right? You feel like, oh man, I'm pretty good. If by looking at the way I'm throwing the ball, this guy's saying I look like Patrick Mahomes, that's pretty good. It's the same thing. Think about that. We are created in God's image, right? We are created in God's image. So the reason I'm saying that is that we are of God, okay? And so that's what I mean by whose I am. If you know who you are from, right, that will inform you about who you are. And then it will tell you what to do. Does that make sense? This is a really important logic here. Okay? Knowing him helps us know ourselves. And when we know ourselves because we know him, then we know what we're to do. What kind of stuff we're to do, right? And so then it goes on, right? This is how, in a simple sort of chart, this is what it looks like to follow God and follow Jesus. Every single day we wake up. We know who God is. We know we are of God. And that informs that I am from God. And once I know who I am based on knowing who God is, and what I mean by knowing that is that he accepts me, he accepts you, no matter what. Right? That's why I'm saying we want to start from a place of acceptance, right? Because when we know that, then we know what the things that we need to do. We know our purpose. Now here's the thing that's important. Because we know our purpose, then we have to live in community and relate to one another. But here's the thing. You see that last image there? It says impact. And what does it say on there? It says what God does through my life. It's not what you do you don't create impact. It's what God does. So here's the thing that is really important. This is, if anything you want to get out of this morning, it's this concept right here, right? This is how we normally live when we ask these questions. Who am I? What do I do? When we go, who am I? What's my purpose? You know where we begin? When someone says to you, hey, who are, who you are, what's your purpose? Have you ever thought about what your purpose in life? What we normally do is we first begin, I don't see this pointing works again. No, it doesn't. It doesn't work on the screen. Okay, I'll just stand over here. Right? So what everybody normally does is when we ask ourselves, what is my purpose? Who am I? We don't begin with whose I am. We go, what do I do right away? Right? What do I do? What am I good at? And then when we figure out what we're good at, then we work backwards. It goes, oh, this is what I'm good at. Therefore, that's who I am. Right? And so then you go, okay, if that's how I'm going to start this out, right? And then maybe if you want to prove it that way, you might even go further. Go, what am I good at? Right? That's who I am. And then I need to do that to please God. Right? Because God only accepts me if I'm good. Right? The problem with that is this. You put all the entire pressure of the impact on yourself. Right? Because if it's true that I'm only good when I do these things well, then I better turn results. I better yield results. That's how most of us live most of our lives. I hate to say this. This is how most Christians tend to live in a Christian life. And it can't be anything opposite more than the gospel. Because the gospel says this. The gospel says, what? It doesn't matter what you have done, right? It doesn't matter what you have done. You can never earn the acceptance of God. Jesus came, he died on the cross. The only thing we do is whether we believe or we don't believe. We receive or reject. That's the only thing we do. That is the only effort we do in that. So if you receive Jesus, you begin from a place of acceptance. And then from there, you go, I know who God is. I know who I am in him. And why that's important? Because when it tells me who I am, it tells me that I am either a son or a daughter of God. Not because of anything else I've done. Do you see the order there? You are who you are first. Your identity is set first, and then you do. Do you guys remember the story of the baptism of Jesus? Right? It says that John's baptizing Jesus, and then the clouds open, and the dove comes, and what is the phrase? This is my son, in whom I am well pleased. That's the comment that the Father says about Jesus. This is my son, identity, who I'm well pleased. Love and affirmation. Do you know where that passage is often placed in the Gospels? That story comes before any of Jesus' ministry. In other words, before Jesus does anything, that comes first. It's to model to us to know God affirms you, accepts you before you do anything for the work of God. See, Jesus knew who he was. He knew who he was. And then he realized what God wanted him to do. Right? And then when we go do that, see, this is what I love about this model. When I discover who I am because I know who God is, that I am a son of God. No matter what I do, I always will be a son of God. And when I serve him in that way, I don't have to worry about the results. Why? Because it's God that does the impact. Does that make sense? Famous, one of my favorite verses of all time now is this one. John 15:5. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Now, I've been in Chinese churches all my life pretty much. And I've heard this passage preached to me, not just Chinese churches, but all the time. Do you know where the emphasis of this passage is always on? Take a guess. What's the emphasis always on this passage? Fruit, right? It's always about the fruit. I've been in church so many times. This is how it's often preached. Jesus is like the vine, we are his branches, right? If you want to see results, if we want to do something, we need to remain in him. So if we want to see the church grow, you want to see the youth ministry grow, you want to see your family grow, you want to have good relations, you want to see results, you want to see fruit in your life, remain in Jesus. Follow Jesus. Now, it's not wrong. The problem, though, is the emphasis is reversed. Remember last night we talked about how the two sons, the parable of the lost son, the parable of the prodigal son, the problem in that story is that both sons didn't want the Father, they just wanted the things of the Father. That's how we preach that sermon, though. We preach it that way. You want fruit? Go follow Jesus. But how's the order of the passage? Does it say, I am the vine, you are the branches? If you want to, okay, let me rephrase that. It's not saying, I am the vine, you are the branches. You will bear much fruit if you remain in me. What's the order? It says, I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me, and I in you, then you will bear fruit. What's the instruction? What's the command? The command isn't to bear fruit. The command is to remain in Jesus. The fruit is the natural flow of remaining in Jesus. But we mix that up all the time. Especially as well-intentioned Christian servants. I want to do for God, I want to do for God, I want to do for God. So I'm going to go do fruit. Let's do this, let's do this, let's do this, and then we pray for God to bless it. Never once asking, does God want us to do it? I've seen this happen in so many churches and building projects. We got to build, we got to build, we got to build, we got to build. Pour all this money into building a project. Not once did the leadership ever go, do you think God wanted us to spend all this money in church building? It's backwards. The command is, remain in me, and then you will bear much fruit, right? See, this is going back to that chart. The fruit is the natural flow of remaining in Jesus. He's the one that bears the fruit in you. You're not the one that bears the fruit. What does Jesus say? Apart from me, this is what we bring to the table. Absolutely nothing. We have nothing to offer. I have nothing to offer you. It's because of Jesus that I remain in him, then there's fruit that comes in your life and my life. The command is to remain in him. So back again, right? The impact, the results, the fruit, that's not our job, that's not your job. Even in Acts chapter 1, it says, and when Jesus says, I will send you the Spirit, right? Right before he goes to heaven, he tells the disciples, I will send you my Spirit and you will be my witnesses to the ends of the earth, right? I'm paraphrasing it. You know what? We think that the Spirit that we're going to receive, we read that passage and we think, I have to evangelize people. And it is. We do need to go spread the word. But the problem is that we subtly tell people this message that you need to convert the person. You need to save the lost. But that's not what the passage says. Jesus says, I will send you my Spirit, and you will be given power to be what? To just be witnesses. We just tell people about Jesus. The results, the fruit, that's not on you, it's not on me. But we take on that burden because we try to identify ourselves. Most of my life growing up in churches, how good of a Christian are you? Do you go to church? How many people have you gotten saved? That's the wrong way of teaching people how to be disciples. Because you're teaching them that if you want to please God, you need to do something. And that's not how at all the gospel. The gospel begins with you start from a place of acceptance. Do we follow? Everyone follow? It's really important. This is super critical. I could have said to you, you're saved by grace, not by works today. And you'd be like, yeah, I already know that. Why am I here? But sometimes we just say these things over and over again without really thinking it through, deepening it in our lives and understanding what we're actually doing. Now you realize this is really important. Not only to our faith, but even the well-being of your life. You want the well springs of your life to flow. This is really, really critical. I'm going to show you this video clip in a moment, but sorry, I just lost my notes right now. There we go. Okay. Has anyone ever read? And when I was in high school, we had to read this book. Did you guys have to read this book anymore? Okay. I try to teach. I use this illustration in my church in Australia, and I forgot they don't really care about baseball, so I had to explain everything about baseball, but. Anyway, this movie, it's based on a book called The Natural. Anyone ever seen or read this book? No? Okay. So there's this book, his name, it's Robert Redford, the actor. But in the book, the character's name is Roy Hobbs. Okay? And Roy Hobbs, it's a fictional story, but he's like the best baseball player, of his time. Right? He was like this phenom, just an amazing baseball player. And at a young age, they discovered him. But the problem was that, he played at a professional level, But in an unfortunate event, he got mixed up in a crime, and he got framed for murder, so he had to go to jail for most of his career. So the story talks about how he comes out of jail, but now he's a lot older, and he's way past his prime. In other words, for someone his age, no one plays professional baseball anymore, right? But because he was so popular, he was so good, the worst team of the league said, we'll take him because we need to sell tickets. This will sell tickets. So they bring him onto the team. They're the worst team in the league. They bring him onto the team, and he plays for them. But because he's so good, it doesn't matter how old he is, he actually builds this team up. And they get far into the league, the season, and they get into the playoffs and so forth. And we're about to watch the scene, just a real short scene, right? And they get to the situation where he's at bat, right? Like he's at his bat, and he needs to do something good here for the team to win and advance in the playoffs. And I just wanted to show you the scene. Now, that's it, one more thing. The one thing you need to know about Roy Hobbs too is that he has this bat called Wonder Boy, okay? And the reason why it's important is because Wonder Boy he used his own hand and he made Wonder Boy, the bat. And what's important about this is that the wood that he used came from a tree that came down because lightning hit the tree. And so in the book, it kind of builds up this sort of almost mystical, kind of like supernatural power, like because lightning hit the tree, the wood's got this, and that's how it's played out. And so for Roy Hobbs, though, the bat symbolizes his greatness. In other words, he is really good. In his mind, he's only good because he's got Wonder Boy, right? And so he always plays a Wonder Boy. And so that's what you need to know as you watch the scene. Let's hope it works.
Go pick me out our winner, Bobby.
It's a powerful scene, actually. Imagine that's not a bat anymore. Imagine that's the thing that you're really, really good at. Or imagine that's the thing that you build your sense of worth and identity on. See, in all of us, there's this moment, this critical moment in a person's life where we've always leaned on as our strength, the thing that keeps us propped up, the thing that makes us who we are. There's always a critical moment in our life when that thing comes crashing down. Like his bat. And it's in that moment you've got some questions now to ask. What do I do here? What do I do? Because in that moment you realize, holy smokes. Like I don't have what I've always leaned on to feel good about myself, to feel a sense of worth, right? So again, whether it's wealth, whether it's status, whether it's what you own, it could be relationships, right? And even today for the younger folks, right? Like social media is another one of these areas now that's becoming like that thing where your sense of value is built around your page, your platform, how many likes you have, how many followers you have. That's all real. I mean, they've done studies now that younger people today, there's never been a time in our world history where there have been so many young people that are suffering from anxiety and depression. It's because they're constantly trying to, their sense of worth is constantly on display to be critiqued and valued and evaluated. I don't envy, really, to be honest, to live in this world as a young person. Even with all the great technology. But there's a moment where everything we've ever leaned on comes crashing down. You know, generally speaking, all right? I'm going to talk about false self I talked about, right? Generally speaking, most people create their false self out of these three areas. In other words, we all have we try to determine our sense of worth from one of these three areas, okay? One is from needing people to like you, okay? So you feel good, you feel like you have value in your life when people like you. The typical people pleaser. That's me. That was me, at least. And then the other one is worth comes from needing control. There are people in this world, they need to be in control. I have to be called the shots. I have to know everything, gotta be laid out. I have to have, because if I'm out of control, then somehow I don't feel that I'm valuable anymore. And then the last one is performance. I have a sneaky suspicion that that's a big one here. If I could be honest, it's often a big one in Asian cultures. I can say that because I am Asian. And I know that. We find a sense of worth based on our performance. If I don't do well at this, I don't feel great. If I do well, I feel great. But the trick is you got to keep doing it to feel good about yourself. See, I think we all generally can fall into any one of these categories, but there's usually one of these that's the dominant one. That's their dominant one. But what happens is that there's always going to be a time where any of these things will come crashing down. In other words, somebody's not going to like you. You're going to be out of control, and you're going to fail at something. Just like the broken bat. At that point, that's a big moment now, because what are you going to do? What are you going to do, right? You see, what happens is that when we have those moments in our life, that's when we begin to ask, who am I really? Who am I really? Now, those experiences are painful, right? They're really painful. So if you were someone that found your sense of worth in a relationship with somebody, and then you break up, that's painful. Because obviously you're hurting from the relationship that's broken up, but it's even more hurt because you feel like you're worthless. If you find your sense of worth in your career and you get fired, that's painful, right? But do you know why it's so painful? Obviously it's painful because you're disappointed, but do you know why it's really painful? It's because something has died. You know what has died? Your false self has died. Now, while that's painful, it's an incredible opportunity to start beginning to explore who your true self is. Because see, and this is why I think these things happen in our lives. Like I hold to a truth that, and I think Jason mentioned this last night, you know, I hold to this truth in my life, and I think it's true because that's how it is. The times that we grow the most in the Lord is in suffering. The times we grow the most in God is when we are broken. It's the contrite heart that God talks about. And so when our false self dies, and it hurts so much when our false self dies. But that's the opportunity when we get to discover who we really are, right? Whose we are tells us who we are, tells us what to do, right? And we start from a place of acceptance. You see, it's in those moments when our false self dies that we really need to hone in, and this is a really key point now. We need to hone in this idea that our validation, the validation of our sense of worth, can only come from God Himself. It needs to begin from God. In other words, it doesn't matter what happens to my life. I start from a place of acceptance, that God loves me. I'm a child of God. That no matter what I do, because of Jesus, I am already accepted. That frees me from the pressure of anything else that happens in my life. Do you guys follow? Really important. Really important. See, the reason why this is so important to me, because this is my whole life. I feel like my whole life is based around this concept. That's why I'm so passionate to talk about this to people, especially young people. Because when I think about my life when I was like early teens, maybe even 10 or 11 or 12, didn't really have someone that spoke this much stuff to me about it. Not this directly. It was assumed maybe, right, that I know this stuff. But it's hard. You know, I share with you, like my personal journey and story is that I really struggled with self-esteem. I had confidence issues. Not in like obvious ways, but I had really low. I mean, the two stories I told you about pinching my nose and, you know, that tells you all that you need to know. I had esteem issues. You know, I felt unloved, even though I mean, this is not a reflection of my parents at all. Like, they loved me. I grew up in a good home. They weren't perfect, but no one says that they're perfect, right? But it was so hard for me to grow up in an environment where every single day you're reminded you're not like one of us, you're not like one of us, you're not like one of us. You're not fitting in. I mean, it took a toll for a long time. And so I grew up with a lot of self-esteem issues. And so the way I dealt with it was, number one, I found my sense of worth when people liked me. So the more friends I had, the better sense of who I was, right? So in high school, like, I did everything for my friends. I still remember I had arguments with my mom. She'd be like, "You do everything to your friends. You don't do anything at home." Right? Like, all that kind of stuff. Because it wasn't necessarily from a place of selfishness. It was from a place of like feeding into this false self. Because if I didn't have my friends, I would be nothing. So I remember, like, I'd do anything. I would help my friends cheat, right? Like, I'd do their homework sometimes, right? If one friend liked the other friend, I'd give them the note, or I'd talk, I'd mediate for them. Every time it was their birthday, I'd make sure I got them a card. I look back at what I used to do, I'd be like, man, you were over the top. But it was driven because I wanted to be liked. And I really didn't want to take the risk of, if I didn't do these things, would they still like me? I didn't want to go near there. I wanted to make sure that they liked me. Even if I didn't believe they liked me, I just needed to think that they liked me, because I needed to feel good about myself. Now that got really hard when I started becoming interested in girls. And I was attracted to girls, and I would ask them out, whatever, and every time I got rejected, it was painful. Not because they said no. Yes, obviously because they said no, but at a deeper level, it wasn't that, no, I didn't want to go on a date, it was, you're not worth it. That's what I heard, that's what I felt. So probably at the ages around 17 all the way to my mid-20s, I wrestled with relationships because there was this, my faith could only grow so much. Because for me, my validation came in having a relationship. And so I finally read this book. Have you guys ever heard of this book, Wild at Heart? It's a great, it's really intended for men, or young men to read. It's a great book. I read it again recently. I don't necessarily agree with everything theologically with it, but the concept is really good. The very basic concept of this book was this. Like, we already just addressed it. You cannot be validated by anything other than God. It needs to come from God. Not a relationship, not a career, not status, not wealth. Your validation begins with God. You start from a place of acceptance. I got this book when I started seminary. It wasn't until I was in seminary. It wasn't until I was in seminary. I was like 24 years old or something like that I finally understood this concept. And what I'm trying to help address today is this concept. If you want to have a faith that matters, and this is going back to last night, it begins with knowing God, who He is, building a relationship with Him. Why is that important? Because when you know who God is, you know who you are and who God is. And what do you know? You know that you are accepted. You know that as soon as you establish that understanding and connection about who you are in God, you know that you are a son or a daughter in God who is loved, cherished, full of worth and value before you even lift one finger to do a thing. If you can understand that, then God informs you what your purpose is. What are the things you're to do? And as you remain in Him, That's your key thing. You remain in him. You relate to him. Right? That's why churches always say, read your Bible. Pray. Go to church. You don't read the Bible for the sake of reading the Bible. I know sometimes we teach that, but that's wrong. We emphasize read the Bible, know the Bible, study the Bible, memorize the Bible. For what? If the answer is so I know it, then that's the wrong answer. The answer should be so that I know God more, so I know him better. What do I pray? Why do I do these disciplines? Why do I have devotions? Why do I have quiet time? It's not just to tick off the box. We're going to get into that later today, the second session. But we don't just tick off the box and say, yep, I did my quiet time. I prayed. The purpose is to know him more. Because the promise is that if we know him more, if we remain in him, what's the promise? We will bear so much fruit. So much fruit. But I want to caution you, fruit isn't always visible fruit. In fact, I'd argue that most of the times it's not visible fruit. See, in churches, we make that verse about bigger church, more people, success. I don't think that's biblical, one at all. When I think of fruit, I think of the what? The fruit of the Spirit. Kindness, goodness, patience. Are any of those things tangible? No, it's internal. The fruit that is born is your character. The things that inside of you is born. That's the fruit. But we always make it about what we see. It's the Western world mentality. But we remain in him. We will bear much fruit. That's the kind of faith that matters to God. Don't begin with what you do. It's really important. I mean, maybe just take a moment right now to reflect. When someone asks you, hey, how's your walk with God? How are you doing with God? What's your relationship with God? The first thing we do is, what have I done? Right? I mean, I do that. I'm the same way. What I'm telling you right now is I'm not excluded. I still struggle with this. But this is my point. Even knowing this stuff, I still struggle with it. How much more do you struggle without knowing this stuff? My point is that this walk with God, it's a daily walk, right? But you need to begin with who he is to know who you are. Because you need to remain in him for the fruit to be born. That's the faith that matters. Do we follow? Good. Well, I can tell everyone's a bit tired now, so we're going to take a break. I'm going to close out. Let me just pray as we close. Father, thank you so much for just this moment, this opportunity. I just pray for your Spirit right now. Just in these next 15 to 20 seconds. We're just going to pause. There's a lot of information there to process. But Lord, I know that each person here, they're not here because by accident. I do honestly believe they're here because of a purpose. You've called them here. Even if they didn't want to be here, Lord, there's a reason why they're here. And I just pray right now, Lord, that deep in the core of their self, the core of their soul, the very inner beings that only you can touch, only you can communicate. Right now, Lord God, I just pray that you would touch that space and let them know they're loved, they're accepted, they have so much worth. They are created in your image. They are your son or daughter. And it's not because of anything they do or will do or have done. It's simply because you accept them as you created them. Fill them, Lord, with that sense of approval. Fill them with that sense of acceptance. Fill them with that sense of freedom. That it's not up to them to see things change or impact. That's your job. Our job is to remain in you. We thank you, Lord, for these promising truths. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. I'll give the time back to Jason.